Our topic today is Brazil's partners in the energy sector. And with us, the great Professor Cleveland Jones,
Thank you,
international
Josiah. Nice to
consultant,
be with you again.
researcher, member of Geoscience Advisory, an XT, Canadian company, and advisor for geopolitics. It's a pleasure, Professor. Thank you.
Yeah, it should be fun.
Uh, Professor Cleveland Jones, with several different countries, Brazil has partnerships in different ways: oil and gas, energy, supply chain, equipment, technology. And could you please bring to us an overview of this chapter of
Yeah,
partnerships in Brazil?
yeah. I think it's important to have that big picture. And indeed, I think that when we talk about Brazil's partners, I want to show this screen for you to
Sure.
look at. The BRICS is the big key for Brazil. And it has to be because, first of all, one of the founding partners and so on. But as a still developing country, sure, it has aspirations because of big population, relatively big uh, economy, and so on. It has aspirations. But the reality is that Brazil, just like Russia and so on, are not part of the EU, the US, Japan, that kind of thing. So we have to temper our ambitions with down to earth ambitions. So the BRICS is the natural association of countries, and it is in Brazil's interest, just as we're hearing nowadays in the news that BRICS itself is expanding and offering to invite other countries. This map is outdated because you see Venezuela there in yellow as an invited country, while it has just been uninvited. But this also,
Was rejected today.
yeah, but this brings up an interesting uh, uh, aspect of geopolitics, especially in the energy sector, because Venezuela used to be a oil powerhouse, is nowadays a midget, but it had a lot of close association with Brazil. With Lula in particular, and Lula was trying to defend the election and all of these things. And now we just see Venezuela just backstab Lula and Brazil and comes out with horrible commentary. But that's life in geopolitics. You pick partners and you don't know what's going to happen. And especially when you pick partners like Venezuela, Iran, or
but
whatever,
but
you
that's a
have
good
problems.
point because there are only poor countries, developing
Yeah,
countries in this group. So
yeah. Well, I mean, China, you could say just
yeah,
because of its size, but you have to recognize China is still a developing country, very advanced in some respects, and of course, military power and all that. But where China is focused on exports to the developed world, but its links are with the developing world. That's where it gets
yeah.
its basic materials, its oil and gas, because it's a major exporter. So this is a natural, very natural group to be in, and it has been working quite well for the group. As you know, even the non-dollar exchange unit that they're developing for the BRICS is something that is of great interest, of course, to Russia because it's sanctions. It has to find an
but
alternative.
but the targets are only on the economic vision,
Well,
nothing different.
yeah, economics. But you see, when you talk geopolitics, it's difficult to separate out energy from economics and so on. Um,
And for military, what do you think?
exactly. You
Today,
mentioned this.
today they announced a very strong partnership between Russia, China,
Yeah,
and North Korea, being military
yeah.
linked.
This just shows how it's difficult to separate out these things because BRICS focused on economic issues, and then it turns into energy, and now it turns into military partnership because it's of interest to some of those members. But of course, there's a downside. This can be harmful for countries as well. You don't want to necessarily be associated with North Korea and so on. It can be harmful in commercial relations for Brazil, for South Africa, for example, and certainly India is watching this thing. It is very wary of that because India is still a counterpoint to China.
But that's a good point because China, Russia, they have a long-term commitment with the
Yeah,
situation that they have today. Brazil, no, it's totally different. In 2 years, you can be
yeah,
in the opposite side, exactly the
yeah.
opposite side.
But for Brazil, the focus here is that Brazil is a supplier of oil. Nowadays, it's a significant exporter of crude oil, over 1.5 million a day, maybe coming into 2 million very soon, and certainly going up. So it is important for China, which has an interest in diversifying its energy sourcing. It's important for India, which has the same objectives as an importer of oil and gas. In terms of other countries, maybe not so much. Of course, as I've said before, I believe Russia is going to go downhill in oil and gas production. So, it's not going to be competing so much. But
Yeah.
it is important for the other major partners in BRICS. Now, if you look at BRICS, is one thing. If you look at the G20, like I mentioned, Brazil has these ambitions, to be among the big guys. And of
Uh-huh.
course, the G20 has China, has Russia, but it also has a developed world, has many countries in Europe, has Japan, Australia, and so on. And of course, the US, Canada. This points out how important it is to be playing in two playgrounds at the same time. Because the G20 now may be less focused on the developing world for Brazil's interest, but it is very much more important in geopolitical standing because that's where you can create partnerships and so on. So even though they may not reflect energy interests as much as the BRICS, this is something that, when Lula just came into power, this government, he, of course, was making a big deal of the G20. Brazil will be there again. So this is important for the geopolitical standing. And the geopolitical standing is what makes a country maybe more attractive for investments, which can then, make potential investments in
Well,
oil and gas and
let,
production.
yeah, let me show that we have Paula Kerber with us.
Oh,
Good afternoon, Paula. It's a pleasure. Thank you for coming.
good to have you, Paula.
But Professor Cleveland, we have G7, G20, NATO, BRICS, now CRINCS, and several other types
Yeah,
of organization. Which one with a leadership, a different leadership, and they
exactly.
trying to push to them to bring to them the most advantages in terms of commercial relationship, but
But
not a partnership in terms of innovation and
yeah, but you
exchange
see,
technology.
that's exactly the point. The BRICS, at least for Brazil, is very focused not just your political standing, especially if it's going to expand, then it's even more important because the expansion might bring in African countries and so on. But the G20, there's not much that Brazil can contribute. It can benefit from the fact that it's an important economic powerhouse. It can benefit geopolitically from standing. So what it might lose in terms of aligning itself with Russia and China and even Venezuela and so on, it might counteract that bad influence with good standing in the G20, where it can act in a different kind of capacity. It has already tried to do diplomatic relations in terms of war, both in Gaza and Ukraine and so on. That's where it can try to mend some fences. But it's obviously, as they say, crises and conflicts and so on is what drives a lot of the geopolitics. We showed this a couple programs back when we said, the world has a lot of conflicts going on at once, and this is just one part of the world. But we can focus here because it's got Ukraine, it's got the Israel and Gaza situation. It has the India and China, even though they just seem to have mended some fences, so there's maybe a slightly less stress there than there was before. But this just goes to show how dynamic all of these conflicts and relationships are. Because even within Africa, you say, well, that's their problem. But it's not just their problem. Countries like Brazil want to be a model for African countries where it still can have some influence, because in relation to those African countries as benefits. Yeah.
This is a very good point, because with what country Brazil has partnerships in the energy sector?
Well, I wouldn't say partnerships. Obviously,
commercial relationships.
Yeah, I would say that. In the energy sector, Brazil has investors from all over the world, because it is a hot play, still is, with the pre-salt and other areas. So there's no question that developed world, the majors and so on, are present in Brazil, and it has to take care of those relations. But in terms of Africa and other developing countries, it works the other way. Brazil, even Petrobras, has an interest in being able to selectively focus some attention on some of those countries. And in terms of biofuels, which is where Brazil can shine, not just oil and gas, it can be a model for development.
But biofuels is not a big volume to compete with oil and things like that.
No, not a big
small quantity.
But in terms of export potential, in terms of leadership and geopolitical standing for African countries and Southeast Asian countries, that is a very big deal. Mm-hmm. Because for many of those countries, biofuels may be a savior. It's already important in Brazil, but Brazil is energy independent in that sense. So, but in many African countries, if they can emulate the ethanol and the biodiesel, they can maybe rise out of energy poverty or reduce their energy poverty. In Southeast Asia, the same thing. Biofuels there are causing great problems environmentally, in Indonesia and so on. Even Europe is trying to limit exports from the region of biofuels because of deforestation. Well, if Brazil is a model, and Brazil is a model in ethanol and so on, then those countries might say, hey, we have a chance to break out of that development model was very destructive, and we can be cut off from exports to Europe, for example. So this developing world, even those conflicts, are important for Brazil, and it has to be there. So you look at Nigeria and Ethiopia, and certainly the Portuguese-speaking countries in Africa, Angola, and so on, Mozambique. That is important for Brazil, and geopolitical standing helps in that respect.
But we are selling commodities for them, not innovation, not technology.
Exactly. We're still, let's say that, Brazil is still selling commodities, but once it begins to be able to export an energy model, how to develop biofuels in particular, and of course export of some industrialized commodities in the effort to reindustrialize, which is going to be very difficult. But that's where Brazil has a chance. It doesn't have much of a chance to export to Europe or the U.S. Normal industrialized products, maybe specialty products, Embraer with planes, that kind of thing. But, the general industrialized products, which Brazil lost a lot of industrial capacity, can be regained exactly in these countries. And then it ties in with energy policy, because Brazil can help some of these countries in their energy efforts, especially oil and gas. This is an area that the majors are involved. But when Brazil's Petrobras goes to Angola or Mozambique or somewhere else, as it well may with the new direction of Petrobras, this can open up areas for investment and reciprocal political standing.
You mentioned oil companies, majors, and are they the same that are investing in renewable, or different companies are investing in
Well,
renewables?
as you know, many of those are retrenching and shying away a little bit from renewables, and I think it's a very wise move on their part. But still, they are the big ones that have the capacity to invest in renewables. So certainly in Brazil, some majors are still there, and now when oil and gas companies are going back to fossil fuels and leaving renewables a little bit, large energy companies, not oil and gas companies, electric companies and so on, are taking up some of the slack. And I think that is it's already being perceived in Brazilian investments in wind and solar. And in terms of China, for example, the big partnership there is with the rest of the developing world because China has enormous capacity, even excess capacity for solar panels and wind energy, and it has to find markets for that excess capacity. The developing world is where it can go. And it
Yes,
is beginning to be that.
but
You and I discussed a while back that the developed world was going into
yeah,
renewables and the developing world wasn't. That is beginning to change
but
just because of
but
the
so
cheap prices.
is more related. These majors you are mentioning more related to Statoil. No, it's not Statoil anymore. It's
Equinor, yeah.
Equinor, Total Energies. So
Yeah,
European companies instead of
exactly.
American companies
Yeah.
investing in renewables.
But even European companies are beginning to take their foot off the gas pedal because they recognize that there is a potential, for example, for offshore wind. They can still be the players, that have that expertise, but it may not make sense for them. And Exxon and the U.S. companies recognize that, but it's important to recognize that other European companies have seen the writing on the wall, and the future is to go back to the core business. The core business is oil and gas, and very selectively you can pick some, offshore wind here and something else there. That's
Yeah, yeah.
where things can go. But it's
Sorry,
important.
your picture was gone.
Oh,
If
just a second.
you want to put, yeah,
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 let me bring it up here. And it's important to go beyond conflicts. Here we see conflicts. Here we see commercial interests of Brazil, export destinations of Brazil, China, United States, Argentina, which is next door, and then the rest. You really have to say, secondary in importance. And yet, what is Brazil doing? It's focusing a lot on countries that are not its major export destinations. Sure, China and Brazil have close links in many cases and mutually beneficial. The United States is still a large partner, so that's important. But Argentina, for example, fell off the cliff when it had a lot of problems and still is coming back. That is a great potential for Brazil because as Argentina recovers, its export potential, even in energy supplies, as Argentina
but
tries.
this chart is important because it shows that China is more important a partner with Brazil than the United States, for instance. That was a big friend in the past.
Yeah, but the United States is important in many other ways as well because of the types of exports that Brazil has to the U.S. and the other way around too. And it's a more balanced trade relation. Brazil has a big surplus with China, and that is likely to get smaller as Brazil imports more and more industrialized products from China. But this gives an idea of what should be the important markets that Brazil should focus on. And all of these, in particular, Argentina, have great potential for energy, not just biofuels, which is maybe a little bit in the future and is more strategic and maybe more focused on less developed countries, but in potential to export well, equipment, for example, Argentina was a big export market for Brazil. That came down, may go up again. Um, just just to look at it a little differently, there's Argentina has a high chance of recovering those numbers into at least maybe double. The European Union as a whole is a very big, almost 100 billion round trip, um, like the U.S. So that's important. Of course, China top, but then you go down and you say India is a relatively small player, but the potential of India is enormous because of its population and a lot of complementary, maybe not in food commodities, but in energy commodities. Complementary trade can develop very much with India. Saudi Arabia is small, but it's an energy powerhouse, and so is the UAE and so on. Russia and Venezuela are insignificant, and yet Brazil, chose to tie itself up, at least orally, maybe not hard agreements with Russia and Venezuela. A dead end, going nowhere. Russia, small imports and exports. It just makes no sense. So that you could say maybe some of those geopolitical arrangements are not entirely logical. There may be ideological, but it is an indication of how commercial potential and energy complementarity should guide how things get looked at.
Is there
And then,
is there any relationship with Brazil with other countries that are not only commodities seller and buyer? I mean, with technologies and innovation, you see something that
well, yes, I mean, technological innovations are being developed in the developed world. Japan, also China, and Brazil is a taker. Unfortunately, Brazil has not been able to develop its science and technology industries other than very niche industries, like I mentioned, airplanes or something like that. But
Mhm.
and maybe electrical equipment, that may be an area that's growing. But in general, Brazil is behind. It has chosen to rely on food commodities and oil and gas, which is very big market, but it is not highly technologically uh, leveraging of the economy, unfortunately for Brazil. So it may, down the line, it could correct that, but that takes 10 years to change. So you're not going to see Brazil other than as a taker of technology for a long time.
Mhm.
But this is important. Now we're talking foreign direct investment. Investment is not just trade. It's not exports and imports. Investment is where countries put their money. And foreign direct investment in Brazil, the United States is still tops. That is important because we say China is so important in exports and so on. But when you export 100 billion, you're maybe bringing a net benefit that is much smaller because you have costs and so on. When you have an investment, a foreign direct investment, you're directly injecting resources in areas that can really take off.
Yeah,
And
but
United
wait a minute. China is not in this chart.
Exactly. Now you say, hey, what happened to China? And this is something that we have to understand. China has invested in Brazil. This is more recent. China did invest in Brazil via oil and gas investments by the Chinese oil companies. Back when there were large uh, concession rounds going on and pre-salt rounds going on. But they put a couple of those $1 billion in there, and that's it. Investing in industries in Brazil is not the way China is going. It is
Wow.
content to invest to do business with Brazil on a trade relationship, and it's very selective in investment. Brazil is not a taker, such as Africa, of large investments in railroads and so on. because it's not as desperate for those as some African countries are. And that's an area that China makes a lot of money because their conditions are very favorable for China. They bring money to countries that could not raise money otherwise, but they demand a lot in
But
return.
please explain me when China buy a port, for instance,
Yeah,
Paranaguá port, is
yeah.
not an
Yeah,
investment, not
that's a
considered.
direct investment, but we're talking $66 billion. If it's a billion or
Yeah,
two here and it's spread over a couple of years, that doesn't make
yeah,
the chart,
yeah.
and
Okay.
that's the where we have to understand the dimension of the investment work. And you look at this other half of the circle, you have a very important part that is distributed among many, many countries. So Brazil is an investment taker. It used to be it was at one time the destination for the highest foreign direct investment in the world. Nowadays, it's not so much. It used to get there at 96 billion a year. Okay, now 66, still a lot of money. Brazil needs that to develop some industries, but it's not as desperate for that as some African countries. So the investments that are coming in are mostly energy related and industrial factories, that kind of thing. It's not
Hmm.
basic science and technology. That's
Uh-huh.
still not in the cards. But so if you look at not just the statistics, but what could be. The UAE, for example, doesn't show up very well because of the way it invests. But 5 billion, yeah, that's important in relation to 60. But look, there's China's hardly makes it, but Qatar, for example, it has 400. Just an example, it has $450 billion in its national wealth fund. Brazil has a minuscule amount because it puts money in and takes it out.
And
But
what's the reason? What's the reason they are not investing in Brazil?
I think they will. I think this is in preparation for the potential that Brazil is showing, and now the relationships with the Middle East, Middle Eastern countries. I think we're laying the groundwork for this change, and this is a perfect example. Saudi Arabia has a national wealth fund as well. I'm just talking Qatar because people don't talk about Qatar's wealth fund as much. But there's 450 billion. If they invest $50 billion in Brazil, that doubles almost foreign direct investment. So the potential is enormous from sources that we don't often think about. So it's very important to establish some of these negotiations, which I think may be in the right direction with Middle Eastern countries. Some of the Gulf countries. There is potential to bring investments. Obviously, Brazil is not going to export oil, it's not going to import oil from them, but in terms of investment, that's important. And we've already seen this uh, when we spoke about LNG a couple of programs ago.
Uh-huh.
We mentioned that the Middle East is now a big investor in U.S. LNG export facilities.
Yeah.
This is a perfect example of diversification of sources and where they're putting their money. And this
Hmm.
can go on in Brazil as well.
Yeah.
So, I think that basically this brings me at least to I think the main takeaways. The priorities for Brazil certainly are BRICS, then, the world, most of the developing world, and then the G20.
Yeah.
That's geopolitical standing. But the implications of two worlds is that they're not coexisting so peacefully. So that is very tricky to negotiate. I think
That's right.
has made some missteps, but that comes with the work. We're going to see more drastic changes in global arrangements. Some countries like Brazil may hit it off right, as it seems to have been doing so with China for a long time now, and even with Russia, because Brazil has imported a lot of cheap diesel from Russia. It benefits from that. That is an important geopolitical arrangement that it's not going to give up, even though it has some cost in geopolitical standing, because naturally the Western world says, "Hey, Brazil, you're
What are you doing?
But when it comes to cheap imports, that speaks loudly. So
That's right.
very noticeable that support for Venezuela, even Cuba in the past, uh, stance, the pro-Russia stance in the Ukraine war, or at least that's how it was interpreted. I don't think that's actually what Brazil thinks, but in trying to be diplomatic, it's trying to be too even-sided for the Western world. That has a geopolitical cost for Brazil, so it's a negative. On the other hand, there are very strong positives that it gains in Africa, India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, which counts in terms of number of countries that will look at Brazil favorably. When there's a UN resolution, then you have that arrangement, diplomatic rounds you make with those countries that can favor Brazil. For example, the European Union trying to limit agricultural exports from Brazil on account of deforestation and so on. Brazil is very scared of that. It needs support from other countries, so this is an important consideration. And with the European Union, that is a major concern because it could be a downside if they start hitting food imports from Brazil. But the poorest developing countries really represent the best upside for Brazil, and it seems to be playing that card well. The energy players are some of those countries where Brazil can bring in some expertise. It can bring in some projects, niche projects. Brazil doesn't have a lot of investment potential to invest in African projects, but it can start them and then pass them on. It has done that in the past. So this, I think, lays out more or less where some of the geopolitical and energy arrangements of Brazil and the rest of the world are.
Professor Cleveland, give me 3 countries that Brazil should invest to become partners in the next 5 years.
There's no question that China is there in all aspects, by far. I think that some of the next players will be BRICS, will be India, because it has a very big upside potential for complementary trade. And then maybe the third is a little bit more difficult because I think that would be more distributed. Maybe, of course, another BRICS like South Africa, also complementary potential. So it just goes to show that BRICS is the focus for Brazil.
Makes sense for me. Great. Thank you so much.
Great.
Great pleasure.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.